Karen demands priority at hospital because she's late for brunch. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The emergency room was teeming with the usual chaos that came hand in hand with flu season. The sharp scent of antiseptic mingled with the low murmur of coughs, sneezes, and occasional groans, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and exhaustion. Nurses darted back and forth, balancing stacks of charts and taking vital signs, while doctors in their white coats hurried through the labyrinth of beds and chairs, their faces etched with weariness but focused determination. Among the throng of sick and anxious faces waiting for their turn, the receptionist sat stoically behind her glass partition, fielding calls and calming irate patients with practiced patience. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the crowded room, where the seats were all filled and some patients even stood, clutching tissues and blankets, trying to find some semblance of comfort in the overcrowded space. It was in the midst of this storm of illness and urgency that the tranquility, as much as an emergency room could have, was suddenly shattered. The glass doors slammed open with a force that startled everyone nearby, and a woman stormed in, her heels clicking aggressively against the linoleum floor as she made a beeline straight for the reception desk. Her voice immediately cut through the dull roar of the room, sharp and commanding, demanding attention from the tired staff and onlookers alike. Wrapped around one of her hands was a thin, blood-stained tissue, and her eyes were wide with a mix of irritation and desperation. Without a moment's hesitation, she leaned forward over the counter, her voice rising in volume as she declared that she needed to be seen immediately. The receptionist, a woman who had grown accustomed to all manner of complaints and outbursts, raised an eyebrow but maintained her calm composure as she politely explained the triage system, the lifeblood of the emergency room's operations that ensured the most critical patients received care first. She spoke in measured tones, emphasizing that everyone would be attended to as quickly as possible based on the severity of their condition. But the woman, who quickly earned the collective disdain of the waiting room, was having none of it. She waved her wrapped hand dismissively and interrupted the receptionist mid-sentence, her voice dripping with entitlement as she insisted that her situation was an emergency and that she was to be prioritized over the others. She revealed that the injury was a paper cut, but what made it urgent, she claimed, was not the injury itself but the fact that she had a brunch reservation in 30 minutes, a social commitment she deemed far more important than the suffering of others around her. Her words fell like a jarring note in the room, a stark contrast to the quiet suffering of those battling fevers, the elderly clutching their chests, or the parents soothing frightened children. Eyes turned toward her, some filled with shock, others with barely concealed annoyance or disbelief at the audacity. Around her, the atmosphere thickened with tension. The receptionist repeated her explanation of the triage process, trying to maintain a professional distance, but the woman's persistence grew louder and more insistent, her voice escalating in pitch and volume until it became a screech that filled the room. She demanded a doctor immediately, waving her hand in front of her face as if the mere presence of a medical professional would instantly heal her minuscule wound. A few patients shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging looks of disbelief and frustration as they witnessed this spectacle. A mother cradling a coughing toddler shot a tired glance at the woman, mouthing the word "really" under her breath. An elderly man, pale and sweating from flu symptoms, muttered something about patience and respect, but it was drowned out by the woman's increasingly loud protests. The nursing staff, ever vigilant to disturbances that might disrupt the delicate balance of care, began to take notice. One nurse near the entrance discreetly moved closer, her eyes narrowed as she assessed the situation, weighing whether this was simply an overdramatic patient or a more serious threat to the calm of the ER. The receptionist kept her voice calm but firm, repeating that the emergency room was for true emergencies and that all patients would be seen in due time. The woman scoffed, claiming that the rules did not apply to her, and insisted that she had made a reservation for brunch and could not afford to wait. She emphasized the word reservation with dramatic flair, as if it were a trump card that outweighed the lives of the sick and injured around her. Bystanders began to murmur among themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others sighed heavily as if the day had suddenly become even more exhausting. A young man clutching his stomach with a bad case of the flu whispered to his companion, "She's serious?" A paper cut, while an older woman near the back of the room tooted loudly. The receptionist glanced around, acknowledging the growing discomfort in the room, and decided to call for assistance quietly over the intercom, summoning security without drawing more attention to the situation. The woman, oblivious to these subtle maneuvers, continued her tirade, her voice rising in pitch and volume, growing more erratic and less coherent as she demanded special treatment, a private room, and immediate care. Despite the clear protocol and the staff's calm efforts to de-escalate the situation, the woman's behavior became more disruptive. She began pacing back and forth in front of the reception desk, clutching her bandaged hand and flailing her arms as she complained about the terrible service and utter incompetence of the hospital staff. She made loud threats about suing the hospital for negligence, claiming she was being discriminated against because of her social standing and her urgent commitment to a brunch reservation. The receptionist's colleague tried to speak with her softly, appealing to reason, but the woman was beyond listening. Her eyes darted wildly as if sensing an invisible enemy, and her voice grew shrill, echoing through the crowded room. The tension in the ER had escalated to a boiling point, with patients looking on helplessly as the peaceful order of the waiting area crumbled. In the midst of the chaos, a security guard entered the ER quietly but with purposeful steps, approaching the reception desk with a calm but authoritative demeanor. He cast a brief glance at the scene, noting the woman's erratic behavior and the staff's strained attempts to manage her. The receptionist discreetly nodded toward the guard, signaling that it was time to intervene. The woman caught sight of the guard and immediately raised her voice even higher, declaring that she had every right to be there and that no one would remove her from the hospital for something as minor as a paper cut. She insisted that her social obligations were just as important as anyone's health crises and that she would not be ignored or dismissed. The security guard stepped forward, his tone firm but professional, and asked the woman to calm down and explain her situation in a quieter voice. He reminded her gently that the emergency room prioritized patients based on the severity of their injuries, and that her paper cut, while unfortunate, was not an emergency. The woman, however, was not placated. She scoffed and refused to cooperate, continuing her loud complaints and insisting that she be seen immediately or she would take legal action. The crowd in the waiting room watched as the tension mounted, the quiet hum of illness and fatigue punctuated by the woman's outburst. Despite the mounting pressure and the presence of security, the woman showed no sign of backing down. She gestured wildly, her face flushed with anger and frustration, demanding to speak to the hospital administrator and threatening to post negative reviews online and call the media. Her insistence on immediate care for what was clearly a minor injury and her blatant disregard for the needs of others created an uncomfortable divide in the room. The security guard, realizing that the situation could only escalate further if left unchecked, prepared to escort the woman away from the reception area, marking the beginning of a confrontation that would soon become the talk of the emergency room during this particularly grueling flu season. The atmosphere in the emergency room had shifted palpably as the woman's loud demands continued to reverberate through the crowded space, piercing the weary haze of flu-stricken patients and overworked medical staff alike. It was as if she had lit a fuse in a room already teetering on edge, where every cough and groan seemed magnified by the stress and exhaustion that the busy season brought. Despite repeated explanations from the receptionist and the subtle but firm presence of security, the woman, whom many were beginning to refer to under their breath as Karen, refused to relent or accept the reality of the triage system. Instead, she escalated her demands with a fervor that seemed disproportionate to her situation. With a voice that oscillated between shrill frustration and theatrical outrage, she insisted not only on being seen immediately but demanded a private room, an on-call doctor to be summoned at once, and, when her initial requests were denied, she began clamoring for a supervisor or someone higher up who could override the hospital's policies and bend the rules in her favor. Karen's insistence that her paper cut was bleeding everywhere took on an almost surreal quality, as she gestured wildly with the hand wrapped loosely in the blood-stained tissue, occasionally removing it just enough to reveal a tiny red mark that looked more like an annoyance than a crisis. She punctuated her demands by clutching her side dramatically, exclaiming she felt dizzy and might faint at any moment, though her flushed cheeks and high energy suggested anything but near collapse. Staff members who had been attending to actual emergencies nearby paused briefly to glance at her, exchanging looks that spoke volumes about their disbelief and irritation. A nurse who was administering fluids to an elderly patient shook her head quietly and muttered under her breath about the challenges of dealing with entitled individuals during such a critical period. The reception area, once a place of controlled order amidst the chaos of an ER in peak flu season, was now a stage for Karen's increasingly disruptive behavior. She paced back and forth in front of the counter, disrupting the line of patients who had patiently been waiting their turn for care, some clutching tissues and others holding feverish children close. One elderly gentleman, clearly fatigued and struggling with breathing difficulties, glanced up with a weary expression and turned away, shaking his head at the spectacle before him. A mother cradling her young child whispered quietly to a friend about how stressful the wait was and how this woman's antics were only making things worse for everyone. The overall mood of the room, already heavy with the weight of illness and worry, grew even more strained as Karen's volume increased and her demands became more absurd. Despite the receptionist's continued calm explanations and pleas for patience, Karen dismissed each word with derision. "I don't care about your protocols," she spat out, her voice dripping with disdain. "I have a brunch reservation in 30 minutes, and if I don't get seen right now, my entire day is ruined." She demanded a private room, declaring that she couldn't possibly wait in the common area among all these sick people who might contaminate her. Her tone was equal parts condescending and panicked, as if her social plans were of more consequence than the lives unfolding around her. The receptionist remained professional but visibly fatigued, her eyes flickering toward the corner where security was waiting silently, prepared to intervene if necessary. The security guard, a tall man with a calm but commanding presence, approached Karen once more, this time speaking in a measured tone that was firm but not confrontational. He asked her again to consider the needs of the other patients and to lower her voice, emphasizing that the emergency room was prioritizing care for those with serious conditions. Karen scoffed at his words, waving him off as if he were an inconvenience rather than an authority figure. "You don't understand," she said, voice raised and voice trembling with agitation. "This is a crisis for me. A paper cut can get infected, you know. What if I get sepsis before brunch? Do you want me to die before I get my avocado toast?" The absurdity of the statement hung in the air, eliciting a few stifled chuckles and skeptical glances from patients and staff alike. As Karen continued her tirade, a hospital administrator stepped out of a nearby office, drawn by the commotion. The administrator, a composed woman in her 40s with years of experience managing patient relations, approached the front desk with a calm but serious expression. She addressed Karen directly, introducing herself and explaining the hospital's policies in a clear and respectful manner. The administrator acknowledged Karen's frustration but reiterated that the emergency room was designed to serve patients based on medical urgency, not social schedules. Karen immediately interrupted, demanding to speak with someone above the administrator, claiming that she was being discriminated against and threatened to involve the media if she wasn't given immediate attention. The administrator maintained her composure, politely but firmly stating that the hospital's responsibility was to all patients present and that exceptions could not be made. She offered to have Karen's injury assessed by a triage nurse, promising a quick evaluation to determine if her condition warranted expedited care. Karen hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing her options, before reluctantly agreeing. The triage nurse, a no-nonsense professional used to dealing with all manner of complaints and dramatic patients, approached and asked Karen to describe her symptoms and show the injury. Karen peeled back the tissue briefly to reveal the paper cut, a small, superficial scrape that was no doubt irritating but hardly an emergency. The nurse nodded sympathetically but explained that while the injury might be uncomfortable, it did not meet the criteria for urgent care and that Karen would have to wait her turn like everyone else. This assessment did little to quell Karen's growing impatience. She began pacing again, muttering under her breath about the incompetence of the hospital and vowing to make a scene if she was not seen promptly. She raised her voice again, attracting the attention of more patients who were already exhausted and anxious. Several people whispered complaints about how unfair it was that someone with such a minor issue was making such a fuss and disrupting the care of others who were clearly much worse off. A father holding his sick child leaned over to a nurse and quietly expressed disbelief that the woman could be so self-centered. Nurses exchanged weary glances, understanding all too well that dealing with entitled patients was one of the less visible challenges of their profession. The security guard, noticing that Karen's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and that she was refusing to cooperate with staff, moved closer once more. He calmly informed her that if she continued to disrupt the emergency room and refused to follow the hospital's rules, they would have no choice but to escort her out for the safety and comfort of the other patients. Karen's eyes flashed with defiance, and she shouted that she was a paying customer and that she had rights. The guard explained that the hospital was a public service, not a restaurant or social club, and that respect and patience were required for everyone's safety. Despite his calm tone, Karen's voice rose into a shriek, attracting even more attention and tension. The situation was reaching a critical point. Staff were struggling to maintain order while still attending to the growing number of patients arriving with flu symptoms and other emergencies. The waiting room had become a battleground between Karen's demands and the hospital's commitment to triage and care. It was clear that if the disruption continued, it would impact not just Karen but everyone else relying on the hospital for urgent medical attention. The security guard prepared to act, knowing that his next move would determine whether the situation would be resolved peacefully or escalate further. Meanwhile, Karen's voice echoed through the ER, her words increasingly frantic as she clung to her sense of entitlement and the dwindling hope of being seen before she missed her precious brunch reservation. The moment had arrived when patients had finally worn thin, and the emergency room, already stretched to its limits by the relentless influx of flu patients and genuine medical crises, was forced to confront the chaos that Karen's presence had wrought. The security guard, standing with a calm but resolute posture near the reception desk, understood the gravity of the situation and knew that the delicate balance of care and order was at stake. Karen, however, seemed oblivious to the collective exhaustion of those around her, her face flushed with a mix of frustration and indignation as she continued to loudly proclaim her grievances. She was now openly defiant, disregarding the repeated requests from hospital staff to lower her voice and respect the needs of others. Her shrill cries about missed social obligations and demands for immediate attention echoed harshly through the sterile halls, bouncing off walls lined with medical posters and emergency instructions. The receptionist, visibly fatigued but maintaining a veneer of professionalism, exchanged weary glances with her colleagues as they prepared for what they hoped would be a swift resolution. As the security guard stepped forward, his voice firm but measured, he addressed Karen once again, requesting that she calm down and cooperate so the situation could be resolved without incident. His presence was imposing, but not threatening. He aimed to de-escalate rather than provoke. Karen, however, refused to be pacified. Her eyes narrowed, and she responded with a volley of accusations, claiming discrimination and mistreatment, accusing the hospital staff of bias against her because of her social status and her insistence on being prioritized. She began to shout about her rights as a patient and a consumer, asserting that she had every entitlement to demand special treatment. Her voice rose to a crescendo as she threatened to sue the hospital, to involve the media, and to unleash a social media storm that would tarnish the hospital's reputation. Her threats felt like a thunderclap in the quiet tension of the room, eliciting gasps and uneasy looks from those nearby. The security guard, unfazed by her outburst, calmly explained that the hospital's priority was to ensure the health and safety of all patients and that disruptive behavior could not be tolerated. He gently but firmly reiterated that if Karen did not comply, he would be compelled to escort her from the premises. Karen's response was to raise her voice even higher, her shriek reverberating off the walls as she proclaimed that she would not be removed for something as trivial as a paper cut. She argued vehemently that her social plans were just as important as anyone's medical needs and that she would not allow herself to be dismissed or ignored. Her words drew sharp reactions from the waiting room crowd. Some patients shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered about how absurd and selfish the woman was being in a place meant to save lives. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the collective frustration palpable as the emergency room's usual controlled chaos was overshadowed by this single, disruptive figure. At this point, the decision was made. The security guard moved closer, extending a hand in a gesture that was both firm and inviting, signaling to Karen that it was time to leave. Karen, sensing the inevitable, resisted. She clenched her wrapped hand tightly and let out a piercing scream about entitlement, injustice, and ruined plans. She accused the hospital of violating her rights and claimed she would not go quietly. Staff watched on anxiously, hoping that the situation would not escalate into a physical altercation, as the guard gently but firmly guided her toward the exit. Karen's shrieks only intensified as she was led away, her voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd, proclaiming that she was being unfairly treated and that she would have her revenge. A few patients offered sighs of relief as the disturbance began to clear, while others looked on with a mixture of sympathy for the staff and exasperation at the woman's behavior. As security escorted Karen from the emergency room, the receptionist finally allowed herself a small breath of relief, though her expression remained weary and strained. Behind the counter, staff exchanged quiet words about the ordeal, recognizing that moments like these tested not only their patients but also their professionalism and dedication to patient care. Nurses returned to their stations, refocusing on the long line of patients who still needed attention, some of whom had been waiting for hours. The atmosphere gradually began to settle, the echoes of Karen's shrieks fading into the background hum of medical machines and whispered conversations. The flu season's relentless demands had momentarily been overshadowed by this spectacle, but the hospital's mission remained unchanged, to provide care to those in genuine need. In the aftermath of Karen's removal, conversations among the waiting patients reflected a mix of emotions. Many expressed frustration at the woman's blatant disregard for others and her entitlement in a place where lives hung in the balance. One elderly man commented quietly to a nurse that it was a reminder of how important it was to respect the system and the staff who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. A mother holding her feverish child nodded in agreement, sharing that her own experience waiting for hours only reinforced how vital patience was in such situations. Others found some relief in the return to order, quietly acknowledging the difficult position the hospital staff were in as they juggled limited resources and a high volume of patients. Some even made light of the incident, joking softly about Karen's brunch emergency and how it had become the unexpected entertainment in an otherwise stressful day. Meanwhile, the hospital staff took a moment to regroup, knowing that these interruptions, though disruptive, were an unfortunate but inevitable part of working in a public healthcare setting during a busy season. The receptionist confided in a colleague about the strain such patients placed on an already overburdened system, reflecting on how important it was to maintain empathy while also enforcing necessary rules. Nurses shared stories of previous encounters with entitled individuals, laughing quietly as they recounted the absurd lengths some went to in order to avoid waiting their turn. The administrator returned to her office, already preparing notes for staff debriefings and reminders about handling difficult patients with professionalism and care. Despite the chaos, the team's commitment to their work remained unwavering, driven by the knowledge that every patient who was seen and treated was a life impacted. Outside the emergency room, Karen's departure was the final note in a story that many would later recount with a mix of disbelief and exasperation. As she left the hospital, still muttering threats and demands, the reality of the situation was clear to everyone who had witnessed it. Emergency rooms were sacred spaces reserved for medical urgency, not social convenience. The incident served as a stark reminder of the delicate balance hospitals had to maintain between compassion and order, between individual needs and the collective good. It was a testament to the resilience of the staff who, despite these challenges, continued to show up day after day, dedicated to saving lives and caring for those in need, regardless of how trying the circumstances. In the quiet that followed, the emergency room slowly returned to its rhythm. Patients continued to arrive, some with fevers and coughs, others with injuries far more serious than a paper cut. Nurses and doctors resumed their tasks, their focus sharpened by the knowledge that every minute counted, every decision mattered. The incident with Karen, while a memorable disruption, was just one story among many in the ongoing narrative of healthcare, a narrative marked by tireless dedication, occasional chaos, and the enduring hope that compassion and professionalism would always prevail. With Karen finally escorted out of the emergency room, a collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the waiting area, as if a heavy, oppressive weight had been lifted from the shoulders of both patients and staff alike. The chaotic crescendo that had dominated the space just moments before slowly dissolved back into the familiar, if still tense, rhythm of a busy hospital during flu season. The fluorescent lights continued to hum softly overhead, casting their cold glow over rows of chairs filled with patients clutching tissues, blankets, and loved ones, while nurses and doctors moved purposefully from one bed to another, prioritizing care based on need rather than the loudest voice. The receptionist, who had borne the brunt of Karen's wrath, leaned back briefly in her chair, rubbing tired eyes as she exchanged exhausted but knowing looks with her colleagues. It was in these moments between storms that the real challenge of emergency medicine became apparent: the ability to reset, to move past disruptions, and to keep the focus on those truly in need. The incident involving Karen, with all its drama and absurdity, lingered like a dark cloud in the background of many conversations that followed throughout the day. Patients whispered among themselves, sharing their perspectives on the woman who had so brazenly demanded to be seen ahead of everyone else for something as minor as a paper cut, simply because she had a brunch reservation she refused to miss. For some, Karen's behavior was a stark example of selfishness and entitlement, a frustrating reminder that even in places dedicated to healing, the reality of human nature's flaws could not be escaped. One elderly woman, her face pale from the flu but her voice steady, told a nurse that the incident had actually helped her put her own weight into perspective, making her grateful for the care she was receiving despite the long hours spent in the crowded waiting room. For others, the episode sparked a discussion about patience and respect, values that seemed so essential in a setting where every minute could mean the difference between life and death. The nursing staff, who had weathered Karen's tirade with a blend of professionalism and quiet endurance, took a moment to debrief among themselves. They shared stories of similar incidents, recognizing that such encounters, while disruptive, were part and parcel of working in healthcare environments that served the public without discrimination. A senior nurse commented that during her years on the job, she had learned that empathy was not always easy, especially when dealing with individuals whose own stresses and fears manifested as hostility or entitlement. Yet she emphasized that maintaining compassion, even in the face of unreasonable demands, was what set healthcare workers apart and was fundamental to providing quality care. Another nurse nodded in agreement, adding that while it was important to enforce rules and ensure safety, it was equally crucial to remember that every patient had a story, often invisible beneath the surface of their behavior. The hospital administrator, after addressing Karen's disruptive behavior with firmness and grace, returned to her office to reflect on the incident. She recognized the delicate balance required in managing patient relations during such a demanding season and planned to organize staff training focused on handling difficult patients with tact and resilience. She understood that the pressures of flu season stretched resources thin and that staff burnout was a real concern that needed addressing. Yet, moments like the one with Karen, though exhausting, reaffirmed the importance of clear policies and the need for unwavering commitment to the principles of triage and fairness. The administrator drafted a memo reminding staff to support each other and to take time when possible to decompress, acknowledging that their work, while often invisible, was vital to the community. Meanwhile, the patients who had witnessed the ordeal gradually returned their attention to their own health concerns, drawing comfort from the restored order and the knowledge that the hospital was a place where care was dispensed based on need and urgency rather than social status or loud demands. Conversations in the waiting room shifted from the spectacle of Karen's tantrum to shared experiences of illness, concerns about recovery, and hopes for a swift end to the flu season. Some patients exchanged tips on home remedies, others talked about the importance of vaccinations, while parents swapped stories about the challenges of caring for sick children. The community within the waiting room, though temporary and born of circumstance, found moments of solidarity and empathy amidst the shared discomfort and uncertainty. A father sitting beside his young daughter, who had been coughing intermittently, whispered words of reassurance, promising that soon she would feel better. An elderly man with a weathered face murmured gratitude toward the nurses, acknowledging their tireless work even as he struggled with his breathing. A teenager, hunched over a phone, glanced up briefly and offered a shy smile to a nurse passing by, a small but meaningful exchange that underscored the human connections that persisted even in sterile hospital environments. The incident with Karen, while a vivid interruption, had ultimately reinforced the collective understanding that the emergency room was a sanctuary for those in genuine need, a place where respect for others and the shared vulnerability of illness demanded patience and kindness. Outside the hospital, Karen's departure marked the conclusion of her ill-fated attempt to circumvent the system. Still muttering complaints and threats under her breath, she retreated from the hospital grounds, her frustration palpable but now directed at a world she felt had wronged her. Unbeknownst to her, the echoes of her tirade had already become a story whispered among hospital staff and patients alike, a cautionary tale illustrating the limits of entitlement and the necessity of humility in places dedicated to healing. While her actions had momentarily disrupted the flow of care, they had also inadvertently highlighted the dedication and professionalism of the hospital team, who had managed the situation with as much grace as possible despite the challenging circumstances. As the day wore on and the flu season continued its unrelenting assault, the emergency room settled into its routine once more. The rhythm of triage assessments, treatment plans, and the comforting presence of compassionate caregivers filled the space, creating a steady pulse that balanced urgency with calm. Patients were gradually seen, diagnoses made, and treatments administered, each interaction a reminder of the hospital's vital role in the community. For the staff, the incident with Karen became one story among many in their collective experience, a moment of chaos that tested their patience but ultimately reaffirmed their purpose. For the patients, it was a reminder of the importance of empathy, respect, and understanding in shared spaces where vulnerability was the common thread. In the final analysis, the tale of Karen's demand to be seen first for a paper cut because she was late for brunch served as a microcosm of broader societal dynamics, entitlement versus empathy, individual desire versus collective need, and the challenges faced by public institutions striving to balance fairness with compassion. The emergency room, a crucible of human fragility and resilience, had withstood the disruption, emerging as a space where dignity and care prevailed. As the fluorescent lights continued to glow softly over the waiting room, the staff prepared for the next patient, the next challenge, carrying with them the quiet knowledge that their work mattered deeply, even when tested by moments of absurdity and entitlement. In that sterile but vital space, amid the coughs and whispered prayers, amid the quiet sacrifices of nurses and doctors and the anxious hopes of patients, the story ended not with a grand resolution or dramatic flourish but with the steady, unyielding commitment to healing that defined the emergency room. Karen's demand, her tantrum, and her removal were but a brief detour in the ongoing narrative of care, a story that would continue long after she was gone, told in the patient glances, the comforting words, and the life-saving actions of those who answered the call to serve. And as the night deepened and the flu season raged on, the emergency room stood ready, steady, compassionate, and unshaken.